Hello, and welcome to the second episode of The Lion's Den. I am your host, Ron Garrett. I'm an atheist with a keen interest in understanding points of view that I disagree with. My guest today is Salvador Cordova, who is a young earth creationist, and there's probably not a point of view that I disagree with more vehemently than young earth creationism, with the possible exception of flat earth or lunar landing denialism. So if you're a flat earther or a lunar landing denialist and would like to come be a guest here in Lion's Den, please let me know. I'd love to have you. But for now, Sal, you and I have actually known each other for quite a while. Back in the pandemic, I ran an online Bible study, and you were a regular there for a while. But for the benefit of the people here who might not know you, why don't you introduce yourself, tell them who you are and what you're about.
I'm Salvador Cordova. I'm semi-retired. Two-thirds of my professional life over 40 years was as a senior engineer and scientist in the aerospace and defense industry. And then 1/3 was I transitioned to biology and molecular biophysics. I have 5 science degrees and working on a 6th. And I worked for a famous genetic engineer, Cornell researcher, John Sanford. And I guess we might talk about that a little bit today. I was raised in a Roman Catholic home, sent off to public school, accepted, believed evolution. My encyclopedias, Collier's Encyclopedia, had pictures of us evolving from like a microbe into fish, and then into land animals, and then prehistoric men, and then humans today, and then becoming astronauts. And to me, that was a very beautiful vision. It was something very dear to my heart because, at least from a kid's standpoint, this looked like, hey, this is God ordaining the world to just get better and better and better. And so that was my view then. And I, somewhere around, I don't know, age 15 or 16, I ran into an ICR tract that talked about the origin of life. And I said, I don't think this squares with what I suspect.
ICR being the Institute for Creation Research.
Yeah, Institute of Creation Research. So I didn't, I really couldn't square when I read Genesis about Adam and Eve, and then would study evolution. And, I was fascinated by Louis Leakey and all the adventures. And later in life, I found out his famous student, Jane Goodall, the primatologist. I had no problem with that. Being raised in the Catholic home, mom and dad didn't care what my origins views were. And then, I went off.
Just to be clear, the official Catholic position on creationism is old earth creationism. That God created the world, but not 6,000 years ago. He did it in a way that's compatible with mainstream science. And so he ordained evolution, and the earth was created 4 billion years ago. So their official position is consistent with all that. So what persuaded you away from that and towards the decidedly non-mainstream young earth view? Well,
so I was an old earth creationist probably half of my adult life. So it wasn't quick. But the more that I began to feel like the establishment wasn't being truthful, because the more science that I studied, I said, this is really disturbing. What I learned in chemistry and physics class doesn't exactly square with the claims of origin of life. Now, origin of life is not the same.
For example, what's one of the things that what's one of the things that you learned? What was do you remember what the earliest thing that you learned that made you start to have doubts?
I actually don't remember specifically, but it was the improbability arguments. Now, that's a whole nother topic, but just kind of intuitively, to the extent living organisms are like machines, it's far easier to break than to make. I mean, if I had to say it succinctly, I said, it just feels like these machines are too complicated. And then, when I started to study computer science and engineering, and then I learned about Turing machines, and then later, much later, von Neumann's self-replicating automata, self-reproducing automata, and von Neumann's a very respected computer scientist and physicist. I said, it just seems inconsistent with normative processes. I'm using the word normative rather than natural because natural has a lot of metaphysical connotations. But mathematically speaking, you can talk about kind of normative modes and then modes that are at the tails of the distribution. So I'm just trying to be careful with my language, but I'd say it wasn't one thing. It was kind of a gradual, the more engineering that I studied. But I think what really happened was when I was working in the aerospace and defense industry, I had passing work in a nanomolecular systems group. I mean, I really emphasize the word passing. And we had some creationists on that, in that group, very talented guys. And one of our colleagues stood up and said, if we really want to understand how to make self-reproducing machines, self-healing and self-assembling, we need to study evolutionary biology. So me and my creationist colleagues are kind of snickering and said, let's see where that proposal goes in a few months. And then, I left the group but I stayed in touch with the colleagues. I said, where did that one go? And he said, well, nowhere. And I said, that doesn't surprise me. So, the study of nanomolecular science began. That's, and I saw how difficult it is to make self-manufacturing, basically a factory that can manufacture other factories. I said, this is a really difficult problem. And it's something, I was wrestling with professionally. The other thing was because I was interested in space exploration, the idea of being able to build, robots that could build themselves is you could maybe send a probe to Mars that had these self-building robots, and then they could build cities for us and we could arrive there. I said, okay, as a teenager, you think about all sorts of things. I was 17 at the time in college. And I said, this is still an interesting problem. And I can't tell you how many hours I ruminated on that problem. Then I began to see the problems we're trying to solve to build these sort of space machines is very similar to the problems in solving origin of life.
Okay, so we actually have a similar origin story. I used to do AI research for NASA, and I left in part because I was frustrated with the pace of progress. I thought the field was stagnant, and I decided that I would never see significant progress in my lifetime because the problem of figuring out how the human brain works is just too hard. And I was obviously very badly wrong about that. Although for 10 or 20 years, it looked like I was right. For 10 or 20 years, there was no apparent progress that I could see from the inside, and then afterwards from the outside for a long time. And then all of a sudden, there was this one breakthrough that kind of opened the floodgates, and now we have AI and self-driving cars. So just because you don't see progress in even a significant fraction of a human lifetime or an entire human lifetime, that doesn't necessarily mean that the problem is actually intractable. It just means that nobody's had the right idea yet, right?
Well, for me, this is applying a lot of intelligence and goal-directedness.
Oh, yeah, sure, of course. But what my point is that you said that the thing that persuaded you was trying to tackle the problem of artificially creating a self-reproducing system and discovering that it was a really hard problem and concluding, therefore, that there must be something, to use your term, extra normative, or most people would think of that as supernatural, some kind of divine intervention required in order to make it happen, right? That was basically your thought process.
That's correct. And I just want to add one thing is that the fact that we are solving these problems and seeing how much technology and how much collective knowledge and how much work it's taken to get there, that hasn't lessened my my viewpoint. We now are starting to see what a monumental challenge this is. And I'm excited, by the way, I'm very excited to be, I'd like to, the field is so difficult, even with maybe I'm trying to attain a PhD in biomolecular engineering, but it's like that barely qualifies me to do squat in nanoengineering because the technology is so hard.
Okay. I mean, nobody disputes that it's very challenging. Where you and I diverge is in our conclusions that so I look at a situation where progress is slow, and decide for my own personal reasons that I'm not going to beat on this problem anymore, and I'm going to use my life to go do other things. But I still retain a firm conviction that someday someone is going to figure this out, even if it's not going to be me. Whereas you conclude that it's impossible. Nobody's ever going to figure this out. The only possible answer is that there was divine intervention, that God did it, right? I'm just trying to.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I see. That's the gist of it. Now, that being said, since I worked for a genetic engineer, some of us have bumped around the idea of whether we can actually ever create life from scratch. If we take, if we put our minds to it, it's a different problem than us being able to make the technology to make a self-reproducing von Neumann automata versus just a chemical soup eventually evolving into that. So they're two separate challenges here. So the origin of life problem is how this could be. To me, okay, let me just explain the way. You'll probably never hear any other creationist state it this way. To me, the origin of life problem is trying to show that this is more or less a normative process, or it's not that extreme in the tails of the distribution, that life will emerge and then kind of evolve in complexity.
Let me try to restate that to make sure that I understood you.
Sure.
The problem is trying to provide a plausible account of how it happened that doesn't rely on some extremely unlikely event happening.
Yes.
Is that a fair restatement? Okay.
I think that's even better than you probably stated it better than I did. Okay. I kind of like that. I'll put that in my book.
Okay, so go on.
So that's a different problem than us trying to put our minds to being able to assemble a self-reproducing robot.
Sure, but they're not completely unrelated, because
correct.
If we can do it, that's evidence that it can be done without supernatural intervention. Now, it might require intelligent intervention, but let's distinguish between supernatural intervention and intelligent intervention and completely naturalistic, what you call normative processes, right? Those are three different categories of explanation, right?
I haven't thought about it clearly, but let's go with your assumption.
Let me put this another way. Even if you can show that the origin of life is extremely improbable on a naturalistic view, it's still possible that life here on Earth was created by some naturalistic, intelligent alien and not a supernatural deity.
That has been postulated. By the way, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the most persuasive arguments that at least told me at my personal level that the origin of life industry is kind of corrupt and a scam, one of them was Fred Hoyle. And by the way, if you'll indulge me, I set this aside just for you, Ron.
Okay.
This book, Evolution from Space.
Yep.
Fred Hoyle. And his other book, The Mathematics of Evolution, he said he's an ex-Christian, and he has described himself as an atheist. And I found in this book, someone else found it on page 28 of this book. He said, so if one proceeds directly and straightforwardly in this matter, without being deflected by a fear incurring the wrath of scientific opinion, one arrives at the conclusion that biomaterials with their amazing measure or order must be the outcome of intelligent design. And he started the whole thing about kind of the natural intelligence and also space alien intervention to create life on Earth. So even though that doesn't agree with my young Earth creationism, I felt like, okay, he's at least someone who's not in agreement with me about God, but he sees kind of the same non-normative behavior.
No,
So,
I get all that.
yeah.
But so far we've still haven't, excuse me, diverged from old Earth creationism. So old Earth creationism will accept everything that we said so far, but you go much further than that, right? You go from, well, it's all extremely unlikely, and if you just look at the structure of the thing and the complexity and the subtlety and the nuance and the teleology, that it seems like something non-naturalistic had a hand in this. I see a lot of daylight between that, and I'm going to put it the same way that I put it to my first inaugural guest here, Samuel. I see a lot of daylight between that and talking snakes.
Yeah.
Because to get from there to young Earth creationism, the only way that I know to do that is to go through Genesis, right?
And I didn't go that route. So
okay, so how did you get to young Earth creationism? That's the thing I really want to understand.
Well,
and let me tell you why I'm really interested in this. The reason I'm really interested in this is because all the arguments from it, subtlety and complexity and teleology, I understand those. And I kind of sympathize with them, despite the fact that I think they're wrong, and I can talk about why they're wrong if you want to go down that. But I don't think that's particularly interesting. But here, the thing that interests me is how somebody like you, who really understands science and biology, can get from this kind of vague notion that something intelligent had to have a hand in it to 6,000 years in talking snakes. Or do you accept the talking snake? I'm not actually sure. Yeah. You said you didn't go through okay. So how do you bridge that gap? That's the thing I want to understand.
Well, by the way, I wasn't turning my back on you. I was actually looking at the bookshelf when you asked these questions. I love props. All right. That's just me.
Okay.
And if you'll indulge me, I'm glad you asked. And if I have the book handy, I'm going to grab it.
I just wanted you to know that I don't I don't mind you going to grab props, but I just want to tell you up front that I might edit those gaps out just to make it flow a little bit better for the audience. Oh, that's fine.
Just to get back, okay, the timeline. I became an evangelical around 1980. And so I was Roman Catholic, evangelical, 1980, first year of college. I was 17 years old. And then for about 23, 25 years afterward, I was old Earth creationist. So all the teleological old Earth arguments that you're hearing, that was me for 25 years. So now you're asking me, there's a lot of daylight between old Earth and ID, and I met Michael Behe. He was my first introduction to intelligent design. Still hardened old Earth creationist. The biggest problem, the two biggest problems, because I was a student of physics, is the distant starlight problem, and then radiometric radioactive dating. Well, there are numerous other problems.
Those are problems for young Earth creationism. But you were an old Earth creationist.
That's why
you were an old Earth creationist. So those were not problems for you. Those were problems that you adopted when you became a young Earth creationist.
Right. So
that doesn't explain how you became a young Earth creationist.
Right. So what I wanted to do is lay forward the problems that started to change my mind, the things that were holding me back. And so I read Genesis. I said, I'm willing to just say, okay, maybe there's a God, but maybe the Bible isn't an accurate description of history. And, so I was, like I said, I had a crisis of faith in 2000. And I said, what can I say about the world that I think I can agree with? I said, I don't think that.
Actually, hold on just a second. You said you were already an evangelical at this point.
Yes. And then
evangelicals believe in biblical literalism.
Not all of them.
Oh, okay.
Not all. Okay. As will happen with any people group, some people will kind of represent their particular viewpoint as representing everyone else that identifies in that group. That's just not, that's not unusual. So you can get some evangelicals will say this is what we believe, and you'll get other evangelicals like Francis Collins and Joshua Swamidass say, well, no, evangelicals can believe in an old earth and evolution. So it just depends on who you talk to.
What to you then is the defining characteristic of an evangelical that distinguishes them from other flavors of Protestants?
I really never thought about that, but I think primarily that the priority of the Bible versus the clergy. So having been a Catholic, you had the Pope and then you had the clergy, and then, the Protestant Reformation kind of changed all that.
Right.
And so what defines evangelical? I'm really not anal about that. Okay. I just know that, if you look at the statements of faith of the churches I attend, that's about it. I hate theology. I'm
not trying to be a stickler, a terminology Nazi. I'm just trying to understand what your mindset actually was.
Yeah. I was like, okay, if you believe the Bible, and I'd read it and I say, I'm trying to see how historical this is. And it's very interesting to be thinking about Noah's flood. And so I'm just like, okay. And then I'd read the genealogy of Jesus Christ in Luke chapter 3, and then Matthew chapter 1. And I'm like, yeah.
And those are different, by the way.
Yes. And I ruminated, and I was like, well, they don't agree. And that's why some people have left the faith. Fred Hoyle, I mentioned him. He left the faith because he saw these the disagreements between the gospels. He found that irreconcilable. Now, just as an aside, much later in life, I ran across famous murder detective works of J. Warner Wallace. He said that's actually very typical of eyewitness testimony. He said he tends to find that makes it more believable. So that's neither here nor there. But you asked, what did I do with that when I read, you go from Jesus, son of Joseph, and it goes all the way back to the kings of Israel, then to Noah, and then to Abraham, and then to Adam. And I'm just like, that looks kind of, what do I do with that? And so independent, and I got to just clue you in a little bit. Most evangelical churches don't touch the creation evolution controversy, despite the reputation of most creationism coming from evangelicals. The churches themselves, the leadership doesn't want to touch it because it's bad for business. They want to haul as many people into the congregation and make as least trouble and avoid tough questions. So ironically, I just kind of was just, I was in a crisis of faith. I said, I don't know what to believe. I need some meaning in life. Yeah, I could take it or leave it, believe the Bible. I said, I don't think I could ever be a full out atheist because I see design all over the place, but I don't know that I'm going to be a creationist. I just started studying all aspects of the origins controversy.
But, between hardcore atheism and biblical literalism, there is this broad range of other options, including Catholicism, by the way, which was in your roots. So why didn't you just go back there?
I think the fundamental answers to your question is, where do I believe the facts actually lie? Now, it doesn't mean that I'm right in my evaluation of the facts, but where do the facts lie? Mm-hmm. And so the journey began. I said, I do believe in, and I do have to mention this for the sake of your audience. In our family, we feel that we have seen answers answers to prayer and miracles. And I've met people that I'm just like, these are ordinary guys. They're not preachers. I said, I think the evidence is there. Most influential.
That's still consistent with Catholicism. Catholicism admits miracles, recognizes miracles. So miracles can't be what got you to hardcore biblical literalism and young earth creationism, right?
Yes. So okay. I'm sorry that I the way I've been describing this has been very circumlocution. I just wanted to say, you could see that there's a thread of me that really to this day, I'll say the old Earth creationists have a lot going for them. You will not see me say that the young Earth creationists have a good case. I've said that publicly. Right. I said, I don't think evidentially we do, but I think, because I was at professional level of gambling. There are times you just like, okay, I think.
Okay, so you just like 3 minutes ago, you said that the thing that led you to young Earth creationism was respecting the truth. And now you just said that you don't think that there's a good evidentiary case for young Earth creationism. So that doesn't
contradictory.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Which is it?
Well, it's kind of like when you look at a court case, if you've ever seen the movie 12 Angry Men, where at first the jurors except for one man thought the guy was guilty. And then you just start to see the progress, and you're just riveted and say the trend is telling you that it looks like the guy's going to be acquitted. That's my intuitive feel. The longer I've been studying this, the trend of the facts seems to be affirming young Earth creationism, even though it's not a slam dunk case. So for me, this feels like the 12 Angry Men and maybe 4 jurors went from 1 juror to 4 jurors.
Okay, but we're still up here in broad brushstrokes, the Cliff Notes version. I want the actual details.
Okay.
Convince me that I'm wrong and that I should be a young Earth creationist.
All right. So the two major areas. Studying physics, we were told the solar system evolved. And I said, okay.
Hold on. Let me just stop you right there. When you say the solar system evolved, and yeah, I see you're holding up a book that says solar system evolution, but the word evolution there, let's see, which book is that?
It's
Taylor. Okay. Yeah, the word evolution there means something very different than it does in biology.
Exactly. Okay, this was written by this is really funny. It's written by a researcher who's in the National Academy of Sciences. He's incredibly pro-evolution, and he hates creationism. And he said, I've written this book to fight all the creationism going around. And this was written in 2002 by Stuart Ross Taylor, published by Cambridge University. So this is not creationist literature. So when I was having my crisis of faith between 2000 and 2002, I was just reading whatever I could grab my hands on. By that time, also, I have had a steep distrust of the clergy, which persists to this day. FYI, I'm in a documentary, and there's going to be documentaries about church corruption. I hate the institutions at this point. So this was just
something we can certainly agree on.
Yes. See, I told you I like you. There's parts of you I really like. So I read this book, and at that time I had my third undergrad degree was in mathematics with a minor in physics, and I'd taken classical mechanics. I read this with, some reasonable physics background. And as I read this, I said, a lot of the chapters said, we can't explain this. This is problematic for how the planet's assembled together. You can't just invoke gravity.
Why not?
You have to kind of read the book. But this
really, you can't summarize it for me? You can't give me a pithy summary of one of the problems?
I will attempt to, and I do apologize to the author. But every chapter was saying we can't explain how this assembled. So the first thing is the different compositions of the planets. And, you can't really apply a general rule of gravity. The problem is, why does the Earth composition so different than Jupiter, et cetera? And then also the construction. And then the moons. Oh, my goodness, the moons. So you can go to Wikipedia and see what the current theory of how the moon came to be. And I'm just like, this doesn't look much different than special creation. Honestly, it looks so absurd where you have
So the problem is deep in the nitty-gritty details of chemical composition of the planets.
Chemical composition, and then the faint young sun paradox. I ran across this. Carl Sagan worked on the faint young sun paradox. And he said, the Earth should be a snowball at this point. And I'm like, yeah, it has to do with the Earth should have gotten so much ice on it when the sun was not as strong, and it would reflect back all the light. And as the sun got brighter and brighter, it still wouldn't solve the problem. We'd either turn to a snowball or have a runaway greenhouse effect. We've still not solved it. And I said, this does look like it's gonna.
Okay, fine.
It'd be solved if you had a young Earth. Created something. And then I started to see about the magnetic fields in all the planets. I said, well, this is a testable hypothesis. I mean, I study electromagnetic theory, and despite all the peer-reviewed papers, it's like, what if the magnetic field is decaying? I said, a lot of this could be solved if you have a young solar system, a young Earth, and if we start to view it. So it's a testable hypothesis to observe the magnetic fields over time.
You can solve everything. You can solve everything with a young Earth.
You could solve a lot of things.
You can solve everything. And the reason you can solve everything with a young Earth is because God's involved. And God is omnipotent, so God can do everything. So you can always, for any observation, you can always explain it by saying God did it.
Yes, that's true.
So it's an unfalsifiable theory.
Well, I've never thought about it in those terms, but what I have often said is, okay, so I use physics to explain motors, and I don't have to invoke God's. We might invoke God in the ultimate sense, but not in the proximal sense. So
he doesn't have a direct hand in the operation. He doesn't have a direct hand in the operation of an electric motor. He might have set things up so that electric motors are possible, but he's not in there pushing things around moment by moment as an electric motor.
You can explain it by normative modes of physics.
Okay.
And so at what point do you start to be willing to invoke singularities? So that leads me to when I started studying cosmology. And we had to study general relativity, a little bit of quantum mechanics, astrophysics. This is the book. This was the book that I studied at Johns Hopkins.
Sure. But let me stop you here for just a second, because again, we've made a big leap from electric motors to cosmology, which is about as big a leap as you can possibly make in this universe.
Sure.
I'd like to fill in some of the steps in between that. So I want to find out exactly where you think non-normative, non-naturalistic explanations start to be required. So electric motors, we've agreed, you can explain naturalistically. Can we use that term naturalistically rather than normative? Because I've never heard anyone use that word as a synonym for naturalistic before, and it just sounds really weird to me.
For the sake, okay, let me just say this. I'm glad you're raising that, because I'm trying to minimize the amount of metaphysics we throw into it, but we'll go with non-naturalistic, meaning, okay, that is the way you would prefer to frame what I call non-normative. And we can go with that.
So you have a very specific non-naturalistic explanation for things. Your explanation is God, by which I mean Jesus, the God of the Bible.
Yes.
Okay. So let's just call him God. And so at some point you think God is necessary to explain things we observe, right? God becomes necessary at some point, and that point is somewhere beyond electric motor, right?
Okay, God's miraculous intervention. So electric motors, I believe God runs that. By the way, Michael Faraday, who discovered what makes electric motors, he believed God is driving that. But what we're talking about is where there is an action where God brings about a singularity.
At some point, you have to go beyond. At some point, you have to go beyond general relativity and the standard model of particle physics in order and invoke an explanation that involves God, which is to say a specific deity described in a book called the Bible, who is a person that you can have conversations with and who intervenes in ways that cause effects that cannot be explained by general relativity and the standard model of particle physics. Yes?
That's not exactly, I'd say you're 80% representing my view.
What's the missing 20%?
I actually believe I would prefer, okay, most creationists you talk to will start with the Bible as their starting point. For me, that wasn't the case, especially like I told you, I had bouts of agnosticism. I nearly left the faith. So I said, I'm willing to believe the Bible if I can at least find reasonable evidence to make me, just like the 12 Angry Men. I don't need 100% proof. I just need to have a shred to hold on to. And if I see the trend expanding, then I'm willing to continue believing. So when I studied cosmology, they talked about all these things where you have stuff moving faster than the speed of light. And just like, okay, so basic physics that you didn't hear about that. And then you read this, and then you talk about naked singularities. And then, in my general relativity course, they mentioned the name Frank Tipler. And Tipler said the singularity is God. And I'm just like, okay, this isn't exactly a theological thing. These are things that scientists are just coming from the equations that they're studying. I said, right. He didn't necessarily grab it from his reading of Genesis. He just
Sure. There are these cosmological gods that people invoke at the boundaries of physics, but that's not your God. Your God is Jesus. That's a very different kind of God than this kind of vague cosmological explanation for things at the boundaries of physics. You're making some very specific claims, and the talking snake is my caricature of that.
Yeah, no. Well, see, this is just like a murder case. There's a very long evidential trail. I mean, how many hours do you have if you wanted to hear my story? And I'm really sorry. I'm trying not.
I don't have a lot of hours, but I'm trying to get you to answer a very specific, well, actually now two very specific questions. The first very specific question is, if we start from electric motors and kind of go up from there. So I'm going to go from electric motors to basic chemistry, and from there to organic chemistry, and from there to biochemistry, and go up the complexity ladder until we get to fully fledged life in the biosphere here on Earth. At what point do you think you need to invoke your God as an explanation? Where does God begin to be required there? And even more specifically, is there anything going on inside my body right now that you think God has an active hand in, moment by moment? Or is what's going on here right now in my body and yours, is that normative or naturalistic?
I think for the most part it's normative, naturalistic.
Okay. So it's only in the origin story that you have to start invoking God.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now we're making some good progress here.
Okay. And I do apologize. You're asking me to be very succinct here, and I feel I'm not doing justice to my case by skipping all all the steps to get there. But I'll skip it for the sake of brevity.
I'm just trying to keep this under 2 hours.
Sure. And I'm going to try to respect that. So if I had to boil it down, I began to find, as I went from being 100% old Earth creationist, and I began to, just like the 12 Angry Men. It's like, well, okay, now
yeah. No, I get all that. So let me just get to my next question, because you answered my first one. Thank you for that. My next question is, you started to have these doubts. You started to believe, you started to become convinced that you had to invoke a supernatural explanation in order to explain the origin story. Why the Bible? Because that's not the only supernatural origin story that's on offer. And in particular, why did you choose why did you choose the Judeo-Christian Islamic origin story over, say, the Hindu origin story?
That's a very good question, and I'll try to be pithy. Perhaps it's better to say how I feel about it now. Okay. As you know, I worked for John Sanford, Genetic Entropy, and as I studied, when I saw the paper by Alexei Kondrashov, and by the way, I studied graduate level bioinformatics with one of his colleagues at the NIH. And he said, why haven't we died 100 times over? So Darwinian evolution is survival of the fittest. The problem is if you have all the offspring being slightly more damaged than the parents, then it's going to go down to deterioration.
Yeah. This is the genetic entropy argument. I'm familiar
Exactly.
with this. For the benefit of the audience, the argument is that there is no naturalistic mechanism that can explain why harmful mutations don't accumulate and cause all life to go extinct. And because there is no explanation for this, it must be the case that life originated in a form that had many fewer harmful mutations than we have today. And that couldn't have happened in deep time. It must have happened fairly recently, like a few thousand years ago. Is that it?
Well, let's say, okay, from an empirical standpoint, definitely not millions of years ago. You can't use that argument to argue exactly 6,500. However, it put me, okay. I'm just like, I no longer sure. believe that the Earth is, I said, I could be empirically a young Earth creationist and say, okay, how about a young life? You'll hear me sometimes use the term young life creationist. I'll say, look, if I don't start at the Bible, I'd still say, I'd agree with Kondrashov. Why are we still alive? I said, one way that it's solved, the problem is solved, is if life is young. And it solves a lot of other problems because... But
there's another way to solve the problem. Especially if you're willing to invoke a deity. And that is that you're wrong about this deity not meddling in the day-to-day, moment-by-moment goings on, but that God is the thing that is reaching in there and fixing things as they break on an ongoing basis and has been doing it for millions of years, right? That's possible?
Yes.
Okay. So how do you eliminate that possibility?
I don't think we do. You find one thing more parsimonious. I find
well, the problem is that if you, I've got a gnat here. If you admit that as a possibility, that's a threat to your faith, because if that's what happened, that means the Bible is wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're willing to entertain that possibility.
Yes.
Okay.
Professional gambling.
All right. Well, kudos to you for that. So the next question is, if that's the case, if this hypothesis that the God is keeping the system maintained on an ongoing basis and has been for millions or billions of years, would you want to know? Or are you happy to just dismiss that possibility as something you're just willing to, despite the fact that you think that it's possible, you don't really care and you're going to stick with your young Earth beliefs regardless? And the next question is, how, if you think it's important, how would you go about ascertaining whether or not it's true or not?
We had a little bit of an internet outage on my end. I do apologize for that.
Yeah, no worries. I'll edit that part out. Start over again. Okay,
so there are limits to what we can possibly know, and we move. I mean, we can be agnostic in terms of certain things, in terms of our emotional beliefs, but we can't be agnostic in the way we live our lives. We will make one decision, we'll sign contracts, we'll make agreements, we'll decide to go out and drive. It's not, I'm trying to say it's not that different from anything. It's only a matter of degree of how much uncertainty we're able to tolerate and still make decisions as if it were true. And that's kind of my position. I would say that what you said about, as I'll characterize it, as progressive creationism, where God comes in and intervenes along the way and kind of helps it along. That's certainly a possibility. And I have dear colleagues like Stephen Meyer, who, as far as I could tell when I interviewed him, he seemed to sound like a progressive creationist, exactly kind of like what you were describing, where there's miracles along the way. But what distinguished it for me was, it's like, okay, what's the most, we hear parsimony used a lot. It's Occam's razor. Now, if we're going to invoke a miracle, it's like, okay, you're going to have one big creation miracle or these little ones. But so it's a parsimony thing. There's no way I could absolutely prove it, but it's like it would solve a lot of problems, because I see some of the magnetic field, and then the chemical dates indicate youth.
Okay, so here's the reason why I would argue for lots of little miracles on the grounds of parsimony rather than one big miracle. And that is that it's a much better odds that we will someday discover a naturalistic explanation for lots of little miracles, especially when they're all the same kind of miracle, than one big miracle. It's going to be a lot easier to find a naturalistic explanation for why the genetic entropy argument is false than to account for a talking snake 6,000 years ago. Would you agree with that?
I will say this: there is, to your point, I have a lot of ID colleagues who are old Earth creationists that would absolutely agree with you. So it's
okay, but I'm not talking to them. I'm talking to you.
Right.
I want to know what you're here because I want to know what you think.
It's the chemical dates that began to really catch my attention.
Okay.
Chemical dates, racemization, and I'd actually worked with a biochemist on this.
Can you explain for the audience what racemization is?
Okay, so the proteins, and I work with biochemists. I publish with biochemists, even though I don't have as much chemistry background as I'd like. The racemization, so the proteins in our body are made of amino acids. All the amino acids are what they call left-handed. If you leave a protein out in its amino acids to just sit there for thousands or millions of years, they'll start to become a 50-50 mixture of left-handed versus right-handed. In fact, your body has to recycle a lot of proteins because they spontaneously, it's kind of like flipping coins, they spontaneously become a 50-50 mix of right-handed and left-handed. You can actually detect someone's age by, unfortunately, your brain doesn't recycle those amino acids very well. And so you start to get more and more of these right-handed amino acids. So when a creature dies,
I've noticed that as I got older.
Oh, so what happened was I started looking at the amino acid levels, the L amino acids, the left-handed amino acid levels across the strata, just by reports they had these oil drilling, these core drills. They're trying to dig for oil, and they'll extract this little cylindrical thing, and they'll find fossils in there, and some of the paleontologists will say, no, that's treasure, let me examine it. And so they started to assess the level of amino acid proportions of right and left-handed, and over like 10 million years they should be 50% mix of left-handed and right-handed. They had an unusually large number of left-handed amino acids, and then also across the strata they tended to be consistent, not totally, but tended to be. And I'm like, well, that would be solved very nicely by a young fossil record. That meant that these creatures died relatively recently.
I don't understand that. Oh, okay. So you're saying that it spontaneously proteins switch from left-handed to right-handed, and that this happens on a time scale that can be measured in a human lifetime because we've got most of our proteins are left-handed. That's the natural healthy state of things. And as we age, right-handed proteins accumulate. So over a single human lifetime, which is to say less than 100 years, we can measure the accumulation of these right-handed proteins, right? So,
correct. In certain parts of the body, some parts of the body recycle it, but in your brain, unfortunately.
But that kind of puts a baseline on the rate at which this spontaneous flipping happens. And it seems like it happens fairly quickly. If it happens fast enough that we can actually measure the accumulation in our brains over a single human lifetime, then it seems to me like even a few thousand years should be more than enough for that flipping to happen a lot in the absence of the kind of cleaning out that happens in the rest of your body. So
that's pretty
I don't
close to
see,
what it is. You got it like 75%.
but you even a young Earth doesn't save you from that. You'd have to have the Earth be just a few hundred years old in order to explain fossils coming up from boreholes in deep layers of geologic strata with a high concentration of left-handed amino acids.
Okay, so there are, it's when I said you're 75% there,
Okay.
Each amino acid has a different clock and it's affected by temperature. So what we can do is we can estimate, let's give the most generous parameters and see how long.
Does the rate go up or down with temperature? As you get hotter, does it go faster or slower?
It goes faster with temperature. So just like.
And the temperature as you go down into the Earth, does it get higher or lower?
That I don't know.
I'll tell you, it gets higher. That there's a reason that lava comes up from lower layers.
Okay.
Right? Molten rock.
So actually, that jogged something in my memory. I had a discussion with Brian Thomas on this, who's a young Earth creationist, published in peer review, by the way. And he said, I said, look, there seems to be an invariance from the upper layers to the bottom layers. And he said, well, that variation could be accountable by temperature. And it's like, this is a tough problem. It does look still too young for me. And so I can't affix an exact date. And this is where I get a little frustrated. The young Earth creationists are talking about fossils. I said, this door is wide open. And by the way, I had a conversation. It's available on the internet. It's kind of hard to dig up because it was like a 5-hour video. And it was me and James Turtz talking about specifically. I said, Dr. Tour, how much would it cost if I dug up these fossils? How much would it cost for us to date this? He said, well, if the laboratory charges you more than $150, you're going to the wrong lab. And just like, dang, why aren't more of us doing this? And so this is an ongoing project, but it's not just racemization. We also things called alpha peptide bonds and oxidation, which I'm not really familiar with. But
we don't have time to get too far into the biological weeds here. I want to wrap up this section of the conversation and change topics, because what I want to talk about in the last moments here. Remember, I started by asking you that I want to understand your perspective and your point of view, and there's obviously some challenges involved in trying to do that in a short amount of time when we're having a discussion that is intended to be viewed by an audience, and we have to respect the needs of the audience. Mm-hmm. But within those constraints, do you feel like I've given you a fair hearing here?
Yes.
Okay.
You're one of my favorite people. That's why I like you.
Okay. And I expected that to be the answer, because where I want to go here is I'm hoping it will not come as a surprise to you that you failed to persuade me. And not only have you failed to persuade me, you failed to persuade me that there is even enough possibility that your argument has merit, that it would be worth my while to look further into it. And the reason for that is I basically pushing and pushing and pushing you to find the one thing that seeded your doubt. And that one thing turned out to be this very narrow detail about left-handed and right-handed amino acids, which just completely fell apart under the most elementary scrutiny that I could give it. Because the fact that you said was problematic is that the fossils were coming up with too many right-handed amino acids when the theoretical model that you presented was predicting, as far as I could tell, the exact opposite result. It doesn't matter.
I'm sorry to stop you.
Okay.
It had an overabundance of left-handed.
But overabundance of left-handed, which are the things that you find in living systems.
Yes.
Okay. But So maybe I've just misunderstood you. Walk me through this again, how an overabundance of left-handed amino acids points to a young Earth.
An overabundance of okay, so a fully decayed, in terms of racemization, 50% fully decayed, 50% right-handed, 50% left-handed. We have, okay, in a living organism, generally 99%, 100% left-handed.
Okay.
When something dies, it slowly goes to the 50% state. We're not at the 50% stage. And it's been in the peer-reviewed literature, secular peer-reviewed literature. They said this is problematic. But why are we finding this?
Okay, but this all turns on the rate at which this process happens, right? If this process happens slowly in the particular circumstances that these fossils exist in, then there's not a problem, right?
Correct.
So in order for you to make your case, you have to eliminate the possibility that there's something about the circumstances in which these fossils have existed that slows the process down.
Correct.
Okay, but you haven't done that.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's why I'm studying chemistry. Why would I still believe it?
Okay, that's fine. I don't want to resolve this here. The only thing I want to establish is that I've given you a fair hearing and that I've come to the conclusion in good faith that your argument doesn't have merit. But the question I want to ask now is, I want to switch from science to theology, because you're also a Christian. Yeah, sure.
If I may say this, what's very frustrating is if we applied the standards that you're applying to me as far as persuasion, then I don't see why people would be believing evolutionary biology, and same for origin of life. So as far as the questions of origins, I don't know that anyone's going to be at the point where they could be 100%. And I do respect the fact that I haven't persuaded you and that I haven't given you enough. I want to say I totally respect that. And you have given me a fair hearing. And if I haven't delivered, I also respect that too. But what I want to say is, like, I would say, because this is representing me and my work, not necessarily criticism of you. It's like, well, the way I look at it, compared to what I have done at determining the chemical details, this is way more than what evolutionary biologists will do for their own theory. They have such lower standards than what I do.
All right, I vehemently disagree with that. But let me just explain why I haven't persuaded you, because I haven't tried, because that's not what this conversation is about.
Sure.
I mean, if you want to have a different conversation where we switch roles and you grill me and I defend my position, I'm happy to do that. But that's not what this conversation is about.
I want to say you've given me a very fair hearing, and the fact that you're not persuaded, I don't take it personally between you and me. I respect the way you've conducted yourself in this.
Appreciate that, because that's kind of the goal of this channel. Yeah. I started this channel because I did this debate with Jim Bob, Made by Jim Bob. And I really didn't like the tenor of the way Jim Bob conducts debates. And so I wanted to have these kinds of discussions in a setting where I could control the tenor of the discussion and not even call it a debate, because I believe that it is important that people be able to talk to people that they vehemently disagree with in a civil manner and part as friends. Especially in today's world, I think that's a skill that we're losing in this society, and one that's important to maintain. And that's kind of my goal with this channel. So let me ask you the last question that I want to ask before we adjourn. You are a Christian, and so stop me if I say something that you don't believe in. But the standard Christian theology is that we were created in God's image. We had a fall from grace. Our default status now is that let me back up a step. There's an afterlife, and our default status in the afterlife is that we go to hell and suffer eternal punishment unless we receive God's grace. And the only way to do that is to accept Jesus as our Lord and Savior. Is that
Yes.
Right? Okay. So obviously I haven't done that because I don't believe in God at all. And so at the moment, I am on the road to eternal punishment in hell. And that's a fate I would just as soon avoid if that's actually what's in store for me. I'm not worried about it because I'm very confident that there is no afterlife, and that when I die, I just re-enter the cosmic void. But the question for you is, since you don't believe that, since you believe that I am on the road to eternal punishment in hell, why hasn't God inspired you and guided you and shown you the way to persuade me even after giving you a fair hearing? That seems like a very unfair thing for God to do to me.
Yes. I do have an answer.
Okay, I'd love to hear it.
I don't know that you'll love the answer, but you'd love to.
I'm just looking for. I just want to know what the answer is. Right.
All right. So
the whole point of the conversation is to find out, to learn what you think.
This is okay. So God could have done this and given you a road to Damascus experience, like the Apostle Paul in Acts, where Paul was Jewish, like I'm
not asking for a road to Damascus. I'm just asking for a persuasive argument.
But it's still the same. It's okay, but it's still the same principle. God could have revealed himself to you.
Okay, but there's still a big difference between what I'm asking for and the road to Damascus, because the road to Damascus was actually a miracle. I'm not asking for a miracle. I'm just asking for a human being to present me an argument that is persuasive to me.
And so your question again was why
hasn't God helped you out?
Why didn't God give me this to persuade you? Is that your question?
Uh-huh.
The best answer I could give, it's 3 parts. I'll try to be quick. Isaiah.
We got plenty of time. I just wanted to move it along to this section of the conversation, but take your time. Give me a complete answer.
Isaiah 45:15. Surely you're a God who hides himself. So God is hidden. Proverbs 25:2. It's the glory of God to conceal a matter. It's the glory of kings to search it out. So there is a hiddenness of God. Somewhere in the Gospels, I believe Matthew chapter 11, the citation may be incorrect, but Jesus says, I glorify you, Father of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children. And then 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where it says, God is chosen, not many of you are noble, not many are wise, not many educated, not many powerful. God has chosen to reveal himself to the lowest of humanity in order to shame the wise and the learned. And so that's my answer, is you're very educated, you're very knowledgeable, and God's plan has been to spare only a few of the very high tier, like yourself. And why does he do that? Well, because maybe he's not as nice as some of the Christian pastors want to say. The viewpoint I have of God is one that's pretty scary. And
okay, so you don't believe that God is omnibenevolent?
No.
Interesting. Because that's definitely not standard Christian theology. Standard Christian theology is that God loves you. God loves everyone. And God wants to have a personal relationship with you, and God wants you to be saved. At least that's the standard Christian theology that I grew up with, growing up in the Deep South, being surrounded by Southern Baptists. But so this is interesting. Tell me more about God.
Well, it even goes back to the Old Testament. Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. And if you actually look through passages, even in the New Testament, it's very unsettling. And so, for what it's worth, since I like you so much, I have prayed for you,
I appreciate
And
that.
I'm sorry I'm not adequate to persuade you, but I have prayed for you, and that's about all I could do. If God chose to give me better arguments, I certainly would have delivered it to you. And I've given you what little I have. And beyond that, I can only do what I can do. The rest is in God's hands.
Yeah. Well, I can say the exact same thing, right? I am here in no small measure because of an experience that I had when I was 12 years old, almost 50 years ago now. Oh my God. I went to a YMCA summer camp and had a conversion experience. Have I told you the story? I've told you the story.
I've heard it in your talk with Sam, and then I've heard it elsewhere. Maybe in your atheist Bible study, I think you've shared it.
Yeah, so I don't want to belabor this, but I had a conversion experience, and then I started reading the Bible, and that deconverted me. But ever since then, I've just been really interested in theology in general, and as is the theme of this this YouTube channel, coming to understand points of view that I don't agree with. But one of the arguments that I hear from Christians a lot, and this really bothers me, is that the reason God hasn't revealed himself to me is because I've rejected him. And I really don't think that I have. I feel like I have sought him out in good faith, and he has just refused to meet me halfway.
By the way, I think what those people have said doesn't agree with my theology, and I do believe you have sought him out in good faith.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
By having this discussion.
The
reason I say that is they used to accuse me of that when I was having doubts, and they're starting to shun me and insult me. And I said, all I did was ask questions. You would think that if you really wanted me to believe, you'd actually exert some effort to try to give me some evidence rather than sending me to Amy Grant concerts. So, seriously, they did that. And I said, look.
No, I absolutely believe you.
So,
and this is one of the reasons, by the way, Sal, one of the reasons I find you personally so fascinating is because in many ways we are intellectual kindred spirits, and we approach this question from some very similar points of view, and we've had some very similar formative experiences, and yet we've ended up in these radically different places. And I just find that fascinating, a fascinating observation that demands explanation. And I'm not sure I still have one, but that's the thing that motivates me to keep engaging with you, is to try to figure this out.
Well, okay, on a theological, at a very personal level, how is it that some people think they've seen miracles more than others? I can't explain. And so for me, I'm a little more inclined to believe in the Bible because I think I've seen answered prayers in my life.
But how do you know that was Jesus answering your prayer and not Allah or Vishnu?
Because I don't think in the ultimate sense you have 100% proof. And many of the things we engage in life. So first off, I think I answered your question. There's no way I can prove it.
Oh, you absolutely answered my question.
Okay.
Yep.
And so.
And the answer is that you don't believe that God is omnibenevolent, and I think that's a perfectly adequate answer. And kudos to you for having the intellectual honesty to say so. Because I think a lot of Christians who are watching this are going to hear that and go, they're going to freak out. They go, oh my God, Sal is totally wrong. God is love. He absolutely loves everybody. And your inbox is going to be filled with Christians trying to set you straight on this.
Well, okay. If they're Christians watching, you can come to my YouTube channel and just wail all you want. I'm just like, okay, the Bible says Jacob I loved, Esau I hated.
Yeah, there's also the other quote that I was a little surprised that you and happy that you didn't invoke it. It's a favorite of Kent Hovind's. He always opens with this whenever he does a debate. It's 2 Peter, the thing about there will arise scoffers.
Oh,
you know
yeah.
this, right?
Second Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. He gave them over to strong delusion so that they mean, something like that.
No,
He
this
quotes
is
it.
actually scoffers. Let me look this up because it's too good to not get the quote right. Yeah, so it's 2 Peter 3:3. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts. So in Kent's view, I am a scoffer, walking after my own lusts, whatever that means.
Okay,
Anyway,
I'm sorry we had to.
I've been trying hard. I'm trying hard not to be a scoffer.
Well, I told you I like you. Okay. So if anytime you want to have another conversation, we can.
Okay,
For what it's
appreciate that.
So.
For anybody watching this, I am actually on the prowl for more guests to have on this channel. So if you are a young Earth creationist or lunar landing denialist or a flat earther or just a Christian apologist or a Muslim apologist, or are there Hindu apologists and Buddhist apologists? If you're out there, yeah, please drop me a line. I'd love to have a conversation like this with you. And I think this is probably as good a point as any to wrap this up, unless you have something else you want to say, Sal.
No, I just want to say thank you for this opportunity. It's been nice that we can actually have a conversation like this and not be pressured by trying to, thrill the audience with debates like you had with Jim Bob or Kent Hovind. I think this is much more productive for us to exchange viewpoints. So thank you.
Well, I hope I asked enough provocative questions that it wasn't too boring for the audience, but not so much that that I left you not wanting to come back. So I count this as a win. So thanks for taking the time, and till next time, we'll see you back in the Lion's Den.